Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the final Atlassian administration talk in the track this afternoon. Next up is a rather interesting talk that I know kind of intimately, as I worked with Roy in the past when we were going through some of these things. I'll let Roy talk a bit more about how he has consolidated Jira instances and some of the pitfalls and the learnings that he's got along the way. So please welcome Roy.
Thank you. So let's begin. Just take through the agenda for today and a bit about me. This is me. It's a kind of, I suppose, a Victorian cosplay type costume. Anyone who doesn't know Sussex doesn't really understand bonfire properly. But I'm from Lewis, and in Lewis we burn things. And at this point, I'd really love to be able to show you what we're burning, but literally on legal advice, I've had to withdraw that. But Lewis is a bonfire town. We celebrate bonfire as it was originally, and we have lots of effigies, which may or may not be of current US presidents or past US presidents. But yeah, take a look and find out about it. Another thing as well, they've been talking about teamwork a lot at the conference, and the town of Lewis is around about 28,000 people. And sometimes you can walk down the town with that number of people and not see anyone you know. But bonfire creates a great community in the town, and as a result, end up seeing people who have been busy throwing fireworks at the night before or drinking large amounts of alcohol. So maybe the trick for teamwork is not just alcohol in meetings, but fireworks and matches. Try it sometime and see what happens. A bit more about myself. 35 years IT professional. I started working in the early days. Most of my work was with Unix in the early days. Unix System 3, Edition 7. If there's anyone with a tie-dye t-shirt and Grateful Dead t-shirt and sandals on, you probably remember that. The rest of you probably won't. I've worked across government, the banking, telecommunications, manufacturing, predominantly been banking. It dawned on me a couple of years ago that I've been 20 years in banking now without actually intentionally getting into banking. And I've been working with Atlassian since 2010. So I'm probably there in the early days, but it's been more involved with Atlassian in the last 4 or 5 years. So a bit about the background. I was working for a bank. It was a Swiss bank. I've actually worked for both Swiss banks. It shouldn't be that difficult to work out which one it was. When I joined the bank, at the time, they didn't know how many instances of Jira they actually had in the bank. They assumed it was around about half a dozen, 10. I did some investigation by trawling Confluence and looking for links, and eventually found 26 live instances of Jira. They were using all versions from version 3 all the way up to the latest version. There was multiple administrators per project. There was no administration control. If someone wanted to make a change to a workflow, they'd add him as an administrator, and we all know the problems that creates. There was numerous plugins. A lot of the plugins were obsolete and no longer used, or no longer supported, but were used in these instances. There was mixed authentication methods from users created locally. Some were authenticating against LDAP, some of them against earlier versions of crowd systems. And as a result, users had multiple IDs. One user may have to log into 4 or 5 different Jira systems to track the projects that they were working on, and each time they were using a different account, be it in my case, Chatmar2 as a login ID or their email address. It would change each time. So the challenge really was to consolidate all that. We also took the decision to implement Jira Data Center. We were one of the first adopters of Jira Data Center. Certainly when I was dealing with Kevin, I think there was probably less than 100 implementations of Data Center at the time, so we were breaking new ground there. When we implemented Data Center, I know it's not about Data Center, but just our background, we originally envisaged instead of having one big machine, we would have maybe 3 or 4 small machines in a Data Center cluster. Our experience told us we actually needed 3 or 4 big machines in that cluster. So if anyone wants to talk about sizing of data center from experience, I'm happy to talk about that. We wanted to migrate all of the Jira instances onto a single instance. So it was a question of lifting the projects from each of these instances onto the exemplar system and moving it in place. and then consolidate and standardize. The benefits, I mean, it's self-explanatory, license savings, you know, of those 27 instances, there was probably around about 15 or 16 of them we were paying for support on. We want all the instances on a supported version. I mean, in some cases, we were paying for support of something which Atlassian were not able to support. You know, we had such an old version, they would tell us, as soon as we came across a problem, upgrade to the latest version. It provided a single portal. Instead of having to log on 4 separate systems to track your projects, you had one system. Reduction in infrastructure footprint, which was a huge gain, and centralized for administration. Instead of having potentially hundreds of administrators, we have a pool of 6 or 7, and a lot more control that way. So where to start? Best place to start is to create a wiki page. Create a blank page and make a note of everything that you're doing. What we tended to do is we had 2 main documents through this process. One was the consolidated lessons learned, and the other one was the lessons learned of this specific migration we were doing. We were only migrating one system at a time. The more lessons we learned, the fewer times we tripped up as we went along. So start off by creating a page and document everything. You can always tidy it up later. Control. Before we started migrating the system, we gained admin access on that system, and we revoked admin access, took it away. That caused lots of problems, but it's the only way you're going to control something. Otherwise, it's like trying to photograph a moving target. It's just not going to happen. We need to understand the system, so we need to review what add-ons we're using, identify the obsolete ones, identify the usage of the add-ons, and purchase licenses where we needed them. We need to consider which projects should be migrated, and we need to do a cleanup before we actually did the move. On the projects that should be migrated, if a team was to say, oh, well, this is our main project, it's got a few thousand issues, we want to convert that, can you bring across these other 6 or 7 projects? They've only got a few issues. My answer to that would be, export it to Excel. Here's your spreadsheet. You've got your issues there. If you're serious about migrating, we'll migrate it, but in most cases, you just want that record, and that's enough. Okay, so the starting point is engage the users, and as I say, move what's necessary. Now, by engaging the users, I mean pester them. Let them know you're doing the migration. Keep them involved weekly, if necessary, with emails, just explaining this is our plans, this is what we try and migrate. Contact the project's administrators who are identified in there. Most of them have probably left the bank, but try and contact who you can. Identify an owner for each of the projects and get them to send you an email saying, we want it converted or we don't want it converted. Don't leave any loose ends, but keep the email going. Let them all of a sudden associate that when they receive an email from Roy Chapman, they know that this is a person doing the migration. They've no excuse to say, we didn't know anything about this. They've got the constant emails. Clean up the source instance. This is probably the most important step, I would argue. Before you start, clean up the source instance. I've given a few examples here, priorities and issue types. Priorities, I can't see any reason why we should have more than 5 priorities. Lowest, low, medium, high, highest, and none. Those are 6 priorities. But from experience, I've come across instances where they've had maybe 30 priorities, and they've not really been priorities. There's been no ordering. You've got lowest, you got the highest as one priority, and then somewhere down the list you've got critical, you've got blocker. There's absolutely no ordering behind it. So standardize on the priorities and change the priorities on the source system before you migrate. The same with the issue types. Try and standardize on issue types and rename where at all possible. I put down there ensure subtasks are identifiable. In one Jira instance, you could have a subtask called Fred, for want of a better name. In another instance, Fred is a standard task. You don't want that type of duplication. So if in doubt, put brackets subtask after the names to identify the subtasks that are on there. Also look for mixed case. So for example, where you have Fred with a capital F or Fred with a lowercase f, try and fix those because those will cause you problems later on. Statuses and resolutions, look for duplications and consolidate again. Take a dump of the live system and bring them out. Does anyone use the ordering of statuses? You won't be able to when you consolidate. You're going to have so many statuses by the end of this exercise, trying to order them, and with the ability of being able to just move them, shift them one position at a time, it's going to happen. Just throw your hands in the air at that one. It's not really going to help. Roles and permissions, try and reduce the number of roles that are used to a bare minimum. Have a standard set on your destination system and try and use that. Less of a problem now with the latest version because you can have different role schemes per project. But previously, if a role was mentioned, if you had 20 roles and you went into the permissions, the users and role screen, you saw all 20 roles. And that would just confuse project administrators. They see a role called project manager and think, oh, yeah, Fred's a project manager, and add him to it, not realizing that it wasn't linked to a permission or to a role on the workflow. So try and tidy those up and consolidate. Remove mentions of user IDs and groups in permission schemes. The user IDs one's probably the most important. If a user ID exists on your source system and that user's left the bank, when you migrate that to the new system, you won't be able to render that screen with the permission scheme on there because it would trip up with that user. So remove them where at all possible. And again, custom fields. You're going to end up with literally hundreds, potentially thousands of custom fields. So where you can consolidate them and rename them, if on the source system you've got RAG, on destinations you've got RAG status, rename RAG to RAG status on the source system. So this is the process for actually doing the migration. I've identified here 4 separate systems. At the left-hand side, we have the source system, which is where we're migrating from. And at the right-hand side, we have the target production system, which is where we're migrating to. In the middle, we have a staged instance. So the first thing we're going to do is take a copy of the source system, and we're going to stage it, upgrade that to a certain version to match it, and then we can migrate from there. And the test instance is a recent copy of production. So we know it's got roughly, 99% of all the custom fields that exist in production and statuses, etc. So it's a good test bed for that. So this is how we would start the process with the source system. We've got a source system which is on version 6.4, and we take a copy of that. We'd build a new stage system, build it from scratch, version 6.4, and we'd import the source and the attachments in place. We'd upgrade to the target system, version 7.12, and then we'd identify any duplicates, install any add-ons, and then we're going to ring fence the data. So there's a little ring fencing was a term that I came up with, and people were asking, what do you mean by ring fencing? So here's an example. If you take a look at this, what is the difference between these two workflows? Anyone? The answer is, I don't know. Looking at a picture doesn't show anything. It tells us nothing about the underlying transitions. We don't know any of the conditions. We don't know those. If you imagine trying to drill into each one of those conditions to see, each one of those transitions to see what properties are set, what conditions are set, what post functions are set, it would take weeks and weeks and weeks. We could try and compare them at an XML level, but if one workflow is slightly, the status box is slightly to the left, it's going to look different, so the diff is going to fail. So there's no way of actually being able to tell the difference between those, okay? Now, I appreciate Atlassian is an Australian company, so any Australians, keep your hands down, try not to answer this, give other people a chance. Can we spot the difference here? Again, it's just 2 examples on there. So, we've got 2 sheep. They look different, So how would we actually spot them in a field? If we were to take our 2 sheep into a field of 100, how would we actually work out which are our sheep and which are someone else's sheep? So at farmer shows, they have a solution for this, which is called ring fencing. And they put their sheep in a ring fence. And they can keep their sheep separate from other people's sheep. So it's an easy way of doing that. And this is the approach that I'm recommending for doing a migration. So for every single project, we're going to ring fence the Jira projects. And by ring fence, I mean ring fence everything. Okay, this list isn't exclusive. There's a few exceptions on here. But for examples on the workflows, make sure that every project has a unique workflow. Now, let's take the example of the default workflow. How many people have come across the default workflow that's been changed on their system? Someone, it happens all the time. So if you used to take a default workflow from your source system and move it to live, you're going to trample over the live system, you're going to mess up everything. I mean, a common thing that I've come across is people don't like the open state and they change it to new. You bring across that workflow, you break everyone's filters. So unique workflows for everyone, unique workflow schemes, unique transition screens, very, very important. A common screen is the comment screen, which is a blank screen which just forces people to put a comment in. I've come across so many cases where teams have added extra fields to that comment screen because it seems the easiest way of doing it. And you bring that across and you mess up existing workflows. My recommendation is all of these entities are all prefixed by the project key to demonstrate, that they are actually unique to that project. Again, with the issue type schemes, we should make sure we have unique issue type schemes, unique issue type screen schemes, and screens, permission schemes. There's the examples on there. So everything that relates to the project is unique to that project with no exceptions. So once we've ring-fenced, the data, this is, we then take a copy of each of those projects. So we need to, there's a tool that I used. I know there are other tools. The reason I chose this tool, it was the first one I came across. I got lucky, it works, but it's a project configurator. I know there's other tools out there, but when I talk about a lot of this, we were using the project configurator. At the time I was using this, I know it's come on quite a bit since then, it was a question of exporting the configuration into an XML file, and then copying that over onto the source system and then importing that configuration. And it would create everything, it would create an empty project based on that configuration. So yeah, we would take an export of the configuration of the project that has now been ring-fenced. When we import it, always use smart context. We don't want to overwrite any custom fields. If they're using the custom field by the same name, we want to make sure that it's got a new context with different values in. Filters, don't migrate them. I know this is quite contentious. I've run this presentation a couple of times at the London org. The general rule of thumb is if you've got a Jira system that's older than, say, 1 day, 50% of the filters won't be used. Most of the filters, like Roy's filter, they'll all be on there. Most of them that are used, no one even knows who supports them. They don't know how they work or anything. If you start bringing across all the filters, you're just going to populate the mess into a new instance. So work with the teams that are using filters, show them how they can take their existing filter and manually paste that into the new instance of Jira. So don't take the filters across. Create the necessary groups in the staging system. As Jira imports the data, it will create any users that are needed. Meant to say about users. Let's go back a bit. You need to fix the users on the source system. If the source system is using one type of user, which is, maybe, a locally created user, we need to change those names on the staging system so they match the user convention on the destination system. Otherwise, you're going to end up creating duplicate users for the same user. So we need to make sure they're fixed on that system. Apologies for not mentioning that earlier. But yeah, when we import the data in Jira, it will create the user accounts as they're imported, but it won't create the groups. So where groups are used by permission schemes or where they're used within the workflows or anything like that, make sure the groups are manually created on the staging system. And then it's just simply a question of moving the attachments into place and importing the data. And the actual attachments are moved into the, correct me if I'm wrong, the import directory. Import attachments is where you put them, and as the data is imported, it will copy them into the data attachments directory for you. When you're doing the import, occasionally you'll come across data that references a custom field that hasn't been referenced elsewhere, so you have to make sure that the context is created for that custom field. But you come across these things as you do the import. So this is an example. This is a test instance we've created. We only want to copy 3 projects, so we only copy 3 projects across. We disable the other projects in the source instance. They're no longer needed. So testing. It's down to the users. This is where we have to engage the project administrators from day one. Let them know that, when this goes wrong, it's their problem, not mine. They're the ones who've got the opportunity to test this and make sure everything's working. So engage them, get them doing the testing. Let them look for references to validate the functionality of the workflow. Look at the logs. If you run a reindex, reindex will throw up quite a few issues. Common issues relate to scripted custom fields that are using the custom field by name or using it by an ID that no longer exists. You'll find those pretty quickly. If you look at the, run the index, look at the log files, you find those and fix those. Make a note of those in your documentation that we've created. And then work with the users to recreate the filters and the dashboards and test their integrations. But yeah, engage the teams from the beginning. As mentioned, the other considerations, the custom fields. If a calculated custom field or a scripted function is using a custom field by its name rather than by its ID, consider changing to use the ID. In all likelihood, you're going to get duplicate names. You create on the source system a custom field called project code, which is a single select custom field on the source system. In all likelihood, there's going to be another custom field called project code on the destination, but that's a multi-select. You've got a duplicate straight away. So start using the IDs of those fields and you reduce any likelihood of those duplications. And again, look for the, where you do have any scripted fields, any scripted custom fields, make sure that you don't use global context for those, because otherwise when you run the reindex, it will try and evaluate those for every single project. So just make sure that they're set up using a local context for the projects that use them. So prepare for live. Number one, order the pizza. It's going to be a long weekend. I recommend that you do this over a weekend. We'll come on to that process soon, but this is what we need to work on. Copy the configuration from the staging system over onto the live system. So we've migrated it on the staging system. We know everything works. That is example. We copy that over and move it into place in preparation for the weekend. Let's not do that at the weekend and find we've got other issues. Fix any custom field references. I mentioned the unique IDs of the custom fields. They will change. There's no way that you can take a custom field ID from a source system, copy it over into the staging system, and then copy it into live, and it to have the same one. You've got about as much luck as rolling a penny down the M1 and it come off at the right junction. Go make a note of the custom fields that we fixed before and fix them again. And then again, the communications, emails, banners, whatever is needed to contact these users to make sure that they know their system will be migrated over that weekend as planned. As I say, weekends are the best time. Bank holiday weekends are ideal. In the UK, Easter weekends seem to be popular with everyone apart from the people doing the migration. But you plan as long as possible and plan the order in which you're going to do the migration. In all likelihood, you won't be finished by the Monday morning, so make sure the important projects are migrated in advance, or certainly the biggest projects are migrated in advance. Lock down the source instance, so you have a known state. So when you lock it down, people ask me, how can you lock it down? If you have the option, clubber the permission schemes on each of the projects that are on there, so that they're available for read-only, but not for any writes. Take a backup of that system, because we know it's in a quiescent state, and then we go with the execution, which is to follow the process. So we would stage, so we would create a new system at that version, we'd install we'd restore the backup, we'd upgrade it, and then we'd take the backup again, and that's what's used for the import. So it becomes quite a wieldy exercise over the weekend. And then post-migration, this is important, and this, hands up, this is the thing that I hadn't really considered when I was doing this migration before. You're going to create an awful lot of mess. You're going to be bringing in so many statuses each time. You're going to be bringing in new user accounts that no longer exist, that have to be deactivated, otherwise you've blown your license counts. You're going to end up with a single custom field with 20 different contexts, one for each project. So, when you want to go in there and update the values in that custom field, you have to update it 20 times. So consolidate and bring these all together. Consolidate the schemes. If you know on the source system that there was a default workflow that was used by 12 of the projects you've migrated, once you've migrated them, you can actually reduce those down to a single workflow. This is the time to do it. And then generally do the tidy up and move anything left over from the migration. Documentation, write up all the lessons that you've learned, because when you do the second migration, either from the same instance or from another instance, you're going to come across the same set of problems again. Okay, and if this resonates, let me know. And if anyone got any questions.
So if you had your time again, what's the one thing you would do differently?
I'm sorry?
So if you had your time again doing all those migrations, what's the one thing you would do differently?
I think the post step, the post consolidation, is the one thing that I would put more focus on. As I said, we started off with 26, 27 instances of Jira. We probably migrated about 8 of them in that time. It took a lot longer than anyone expected with all the testing and everything. Each time we learnt lessons, each time we documented them, so the next time we didn't trip up as we went through that process. So we got slicker as we went through the process, but we ended up creating a bigger and a bigger and a bigger instance. I mean, one problem which really caused us problems was each project had its own issue. I'm just get the right terminology now. Help me, the scheme that decides the field configuration scheme, that was it, field configuration scheme for each different project. So when we went into the screen with all the field configurations, we'd hit the button, we'd head off down the pub for a couple of hours, and we'd come back, and if we're lucky, it rendered that screen, you know? That is one of the really slow screens. I don't think that's been fixed, but we had thousands of these field configurations. So, you know, where you know they're based on the same, consolidating them would have been a big, big gain. And engage someone like a BA, business analyst, to actually look at the custom fields and see what consolidation can be done there, and start removing custom fields that are not used. And something that I picked up this week, which I can't wait to go back and actually do, they're talking about optimizing custom fields. So where we have any global custom fields, remove them down to, so you just have the context of the projects that use it. By all accounts, that's going to give quite a gain. We were looking at the time, it's about 4 or 5 hours indexing time, I seem to recall. And this was after throwing hardware at the problem. We were rapidly facing a situation where there was not going to be enough minutes in the day to re-index. So yeah, it just became a greater problem.
Thanks for the talk. My question is related to the tools or apps used to succeed this migration and consolidation.
I'm sorry, could you say that again? My hearing is...
the tools or apps used to succeed this migration.
The apps used, yeah, we use the project configurator. At the time it was looked after by a one-man band, Pepe. I understand it's being purchased by Adaptivist now. It did the job, and there are, you know, just like with browsers, there are other browsers out there. We picked the one that works for us, and it works. It did the job.
Hands up for more questions.
Hi, Roy. You said you gave individual names to all projects. Did you not think of using the source instance as your unique identifier for all your different schemes and settings?
So could you say it again? So I had to tune into someone's voice. This tinnitus is really playing out.
You said you set individual names on the source instance of all your schemes,
Yeah.
configurations, etc., on a project basis.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have a reason why you didn't just use a prefix that identified it against the source instance?
We prefixed each of the schemes that we created with the key deliberately. At one point, we did look at trying to keep, if I've heard the question correctly, we did look at trying to keep, where a scheme was common on the source instance, we tried to keep those workflows and bring them all across in one set. The problem that we had with that was, because of the order that we're migrating the projects, people were going in and making changes as soon as the project was migrated, and then we were bringing across 2 weeks later the projects again and overwriting the changes that have been made. So yeah, keeping the unique names and keeping them unique until after the full instance was migrated was the safest way forward. I don't know if that answered the question. Close, okay.
One of the things that I've seen is that the technology is relatively easy, and it's the people that are difficult. How did you get buy-in from the 26 instances? Because quite often people are, I want to run my instance of Jira, where I have admin and I get to look after my particular pet projects. So how was that not a problem because you were going to this one single instance within the bank?
Okay, so let's look at the lifespan of a Jira instance back in 2010, 2012, around this time frame. Jira was cheap, everyone was talking about it, a team would get it in and would install it. Someone would be really enthusiastic and they would set it up, and then they would leave the bank. And what you ended up with was an orphan instance of Jira, as was the case in a lot of these instances. No one had got around to upgrading it, the plugins were out of date, they're obsolete, no one was supporting it. Didn't know anything about the administration, so they just threw administrators at the problem. In some ways, when I came along, I was a savior for these instances. So actually saying to people, we're planning to move it onto something that's supportable, was a win-win for everyone. There was obviously exceptions to that. There was always, certain individuals who were determined to keep their administration access. That was a fight. But it was one that they weren't going to be able to win. The best I could do is put them to the end of the queue and say, okay, you chew over it for another 6 months and we'll migrate someone else in front of you. We didn't want to give in on that. For the actual teams that wanted to work on their own workflows and change their schemes, that's what the UAT instance was for. We'd give them administration access on there, and we'd give them a set of rules if they wanted to change a project. So let's say, for example, they wanted to add a single field to a screen. The instruction was you've got to copy the screen, create a new version, got to copy the screen scheme, a new version, a new issue type screen scheme, then add the value, yeah? So when we use the project configurator, it just brought across the new issue type screen scheme, and screen. And that was the way of doing it. So each time they brought the changes across, they weren't overwriting anything that was already in place. And that was the way we safely ensured they didn't do it. Lessons learned from that was, we've all seen it in the workflows. You right-click on a status, and you can rename the status. So you had to be careful to make sure someone hadn't actually done that, especially the open status renamed to new, because that broke everything for everyone. So, those were the lessons or takeaways from that.
Hi, Roy. Thanks for sharing your journey. You mentioned 26 instances. What was like the min, max, and total number of issues?
Oh, wow. The numbers that I seem to remember, we got over 1 million issues by time, well over 1 million issues by time. With 13,000 users, active users, were brought in. Some of the instances that we had were just very small instances, maybe a dozen projects. Some of them were slightly larger. I mean, one of them had over 1,000 projects. And certainly the destination instance that we had was approaching 2,000 projects by the time I moved away from the project. We were creating a monster. But data center actually works. I know there were problems. I know there were problems at the time, and Kevin will tell you because I burnt his ear screaming at him down the phone many a time. But it did work. It did do the job. There was no way we could do that in a standalone system. So, fortunately, we had chosen the right architecture to migrate it to.
Hey, a question about the add-ons. What add-ons were migrated as part of this?
Add-ons?
Yes. Like portfolio or any of the others for the configuration or structure, user data add-ons?
We tried to keep to a minimum the add-ons that we were using. As part of the original audit, when we found the 26 instances, we checked what add-ons were in use. So we had a pretty reasonable catalog of what was to expect. There was a few instances where some teams were using for example, Glyphy and Balsamic on Jira, and we didn't really want to purchase those licenses. We just want to use that in Confluence. So that kind of threw up a few type of issues. We found a lot of obsolete plugins. There's one which I seem to remember was called the Metro plugin, which had a few workflow functions. One of them created a number of subtasks as a post task. We identified that and we used the script runner as a suitable replacement for that. By and large, I mean, like for example, test tools, there was one team was using X-Ray, one was using Zephyr. We had to standardize on one of those test tools. We couldn't have both of them in place. So there was a lot of negotiation with teams. What tended to win was the destination instance. That was the exemplar. So we had X-Ray there, better or worse, I can't remember, but we had X-Ray there. So when a team wanted to bring Zephyr across, it wasn't an option. They had to change their test cases. But we found tools to export and import them. But yeah, we try and keep it to a minimum. The current place that I'm at the moment has got that number of add-ons, and it is the bane of my life trying to keep on those up to date. So the fewer number of add-ons, the better.
My question is related to the filters. So you suggested we should not migrate filters in the live.
I'm sorry, could you say again?
My question is related to the filters.
Yeah.
Filters and dashboards.
Mm-hmm.
You suggested we should not migrate such stuff to the live instance.
Mm-hmm.
So it might be hundreds of filters, dashboards reporting in the previous instance. How do you manage this kind of situation?
Okay.
With lot of users.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, first of all, as I explained with filters, most of the filters on the source system were not used or were not supported. That was the first issue. Secondly, filters would reference custom fields by the name, and that would give likely issues with duplicate custom field names on the destination system, or the referencing by the ID, which wouldn't work on the destination system anyhow. And then there would be permission issues. So a filter may have been created by a user who left the company 2 years ago, and you wouldn't have access to those. So we took the decision not to migrate the filters, but we'd have to work with each of the teams. 80% of the cases where the filters were used, the teams knew how the filters work, how the dashboards worked. They knew it was less than 30 minutes to recreate what they needed. In the other case, 20%, we would sit down with the people. This is your filter. This is how you copy and paste it. We'd let them do it so they gained ownership of the filter. They'd learn how the filter works. It was a good training exercise as well, but the general pushback was minimal, really. That was the least of the pushback we got from the users.
Thank you for your presentation from my side as well. I have a remark and a question. The remark is we had the same situation regarding reading workflows that you showed. You can see what's behind it. I don't know how new or old is it, but there is a plugin called Workflow Analyzer or something similar.
Mm-hmm.
And the neat thing about this is it shows your workflow in a text form, completely structured with whatever is behind the scene. It's like conditions, post functions, etc., etc. We use it for a documentation, maybe for your future projects should be. Maybe it's useful.
Yeah, that would be good.
Yeah.
To be able to actually visualize a workflow and see the conditions.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Like.
Yeah.
And my question is, if I understood correctly, you had a big bang approach. Like you kind of did it like in a weekend, all the 26 instances.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do you think would be the pros and cons compared to a sequential migration that you say, I get the first instance, I let them work with it for a week, established, and then kind of this main instance absorbs the other instances gradually. Like every 2 weeks, there's a new instance coming in.
Mm-hmm.
What would you think would be the difference or benefits of this or that approach?
Well, obviously performance will take a hit. Any time you do any work, certainly with that version of Data Center, with any of the custom fields, you could end up killing the system. So for example, when we're using Project Configurator to create the projects, there was a noticeable hit on the system. When we're trying to, any context that was hit on the system. So if you could schedule that for the weekend, it should be fine. Importing the data is probably no more impact than a bulk import would be from a spreadsheet, except you've got more than 1,000 rows. No, we ended up having to do a lot of the migrations during the week. As I say, the process of taking a backup from the source system, staging it, upgrading it, putting the plugins in, taking another backup, moving the attachments in place, copying. We were well into Sunday before we started to import our first project in some cases. Yeah, so we had to run into start doing these over the week. But then there's the demand of the users. Some of the teams, always the ones with the biggest projects, wanted to be able to start working on those projects on the Monday morning. It just wasn't acceptable for them not to have access on the Monday morning. So we did do sequential migrations. We did do them over the week, but the bulk of the work was done over the weekend. And that's where you work with the teams. If in all likelihood your project's not going to be migrated on Monday, is that going to be a problem to you? If yes, we've got to find some other way around it. Yeah.
Hello. From a maintenance point of view and migration point of view, what's your recommendation in the case that there are, for instance, two projects using very similar issue types? What would be the better, to have different issue types or use the same issue type with different fields configured? Thank you.
Where we can, we would tidy up the issue types on the source system before we did the migration. As I said, we would try and identify subtasks by including the word subtask in the name of the issue type to prevent any conflicts. But yeah, it comes down to consolidation that I mentioned. If we can tidy it up on the source system, likelihood is on the source system you've got 50 issue types. On the destination system you've got 1,500. It's going to be easier to tidy up those 50 issue types before you start the migration than to bring them across, potentially bring in 30 new types and have to tidy them up afterwards. So that would be my approach. Try and tidy as much on the source system as possible.
All right, that's all the questions we have time for. So Roy, I'm sure, will make himself available outside afterwards if anybody still has any remaining questions. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.